Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line here in the Israeli-Palestinian war. And over the past 2 days, the Israeli forces have not been able to advance anywhere on the front line. The reason for this is that we're now seeing that they are facing off against the Hamas forces in the urban areas of Gaza City, Jabalia camp area, Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun. So these four areas are urban areas where the Israeli and Palestinian forces are now fighting. Initially, the Israeli forces were advancing without much resistance. The reason for this is they were going through the more open areas where there is less resistance, as without urban areas to cover for the Hamas fighters, they are unlikely to face off against the Israeli forces. They do, however, have a lot of tunnels all across the open areas. So when the Israeli forces advance through them, we do see videos of Hamas fighters going up through these tunnels in the forest areas and bushes, where they try to, under the cover of the bushes, go up, hit some tanks, and then go back down without getting detected. We've seen some videos of this, for example, in the latest video. And we see additional footage of this, but now it has mostly entered urban areas, as most of the open fields rather than the urban areas have already been taken by the Israeli forces, as we see here to the north and in the central parts, where the fighting has now reached the beaches, the houses by the beaches, and most importantly the urban areas here by Jabalia and Beit Hanun. So these are the two areas where there's the most fighting. There's also some by Atatra. Zooming this far in, we see the concentration of buildings here in this area goes more and more the deeper you go into the central parts, when you reach the real parts of the city where there is a lot of high-rise buildings, apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, and so on, that are more intense, more filled out than the areas here by the suburban areas where there's mostly just houses and some forest lines in between. But these are also the areas where we see the most tunnels exits being, besides being inside the houses. So here there's better overview once the Hamas forces go outside of the tunnels, but these are also easier to be spotted than the ones within the buildings. From all the fighting over the past 2 days, we get this video here released by Hamas, where we see a lot of tanks by the Israeli forces, as well as armored personnel carriers, getting hit by RPGs in the urban areas. So we see first off this video here where a Israeli armored personnel carrier is getting hit by RPGs, first from the perspective of the video. We also see further on additional footage of Israeli tanks being within the forest parts of the city, and behind the wall there are multiple Hamas fighters with RPGs shooting at these tanks. And this happens multiple places around the city and also by the beaches, where we see that there are these walls that the Hamas fighters are fighting from behind in cover, shooting RPGs and then running away as soon as they have shot their shot, and then returning to areas with tunnels so they can go back inside the tunnels. So we see multiple videos from everywhere throughout the city of these RPGs hitting tanks. And then finally we see this video here, which is from a Hamas fighter looking at one of the armored bulldozers that was abandoned by Israeli forces. He goes up, throws a Molotov cocktail after pouring some oil or gas on the armored bulldozer, leaving it to burn with a Hamas flag on top of it. And meanwhile, the footage we see from the Israeli side is usually just something like this, where a tank is shooting at a building, or this, where we see an Israeli airstrike during the nighttime. Either case, we hardly get anything out of these videos compared to the Hamas videos, where we see tanks being shot by RPGs. Here we see buildings being hit by rockets, tanks, airstrikes. In the end, we don't see what is actually inside the building. This is the advantages of the tunnels. The tunnels allow the Palestinian forces to get in and out of these areas very quickly. So unless the Israeli forces already know someone is somewhere, it is very hard for them to detect them. Therefore, we see that the majority of the fighting taking place by the Israeli forces is actually the airstrikes, while the face-to-face fighting is usually a hit and run by Palestinian forces. So the fighting in a nutshell is the Israelis using technology and the Hamas fighters using wits. and this will continue until the Israeli forces find multiple tunnels and start entering them. Then we will see much more elaborate fighting between the two sides' soldiers. The Israelis will have night gear and so on, which will give them an advantage in the dark tunnels. The Palestinian forces have the advantage that they already know these tunnels, while the Israeli forces have to map them out. So there is going to be a lot of ambushes and so on within the tunnels as well. But currently what we're seeing is that the Israeli forces are slowly trying to advance through these urban areas, but now they are under constant ambushes every day, constantly, as the Palestinian forces continuously muster up new plans to try to ambush the Israeli forces and try to cut them off before they advance further. So the current situation is direct proof that the defender always has the initiative in urban fighting, especially due to the elaborate tunnels that the Hamas fighters have built, which are rumored to be over 500 kilometers in area length. So we see that there's a lot of tunnels under these cities, and the Hamas fighters are making full use of it. We already see that Israeli forces have seen some entrances. They mostly just block them off, but sometimes they've also sent guard dogs and so on through them, trying to map it out with their detectors. However, according to other sources, this is just footage from a training session with these guard dogs, and they'd say that this is a training arm sleeve. So this is fake footage made to seem as if they are using them in the conflict zone, but there's no evidence of them doing so far because this seems to be footage from a training session. It seems that this clearly indicates the war will likely drag out for a long time, as through now a week's fighting, we see that the Israeli forces have managed to surround Gaza City, but they haven't really managed to get a proper foothold. They have some positions here to the northwest, but it seems that the Palestinians allowed them to get this far in to then start ambushing them. So we're seeing that they hold no real control here in this area, and the fighting is continuing in all directions. So the current situation doesn't seem to be in the favor of the Israelis finishing this war quickly, and this is actually a major issue for Israel because they have their official goal to be the complete destruction of Hamas. They want to completely root out Hamas in all of Gaza, but the international pressure on them continuing this war is very tough on the Israeli mindset. We see that because we see multiple videos from all around the world, of which we see a few that I've picked out. One of them being the Washington protests, which rumored to be above 60,000 people who demonstrated in front of the White House in Washington, D.C. Then we also have demonstrations in places like France, Jakarta, Indonesia, and even in front of Netanyahu's home. The reason for this is that we see that Israelis mostly take Netanyahu himself as the one responsible for the failure of the Israeli forces on the first day of the war on the 7th of October. The failure of the Israeli forces to detect the Hamas movement and the failure of the Israeli forces to respond to the Hamas movement. So we see that there was a lot of things that went wrong on the 7th of October from the perspective of the average Israeli. And who is to blame? It is the leader of the country at the time of the catastrophe. With latest polls is suggesting that Netanyahu's approval ratings all the way down to just 24%, with 47% of Israelis wanting him to resign after the war. And all of this while prior to the war, there were already major demonstrations against Netanyahu as he was trying to change the constitution of the country to try and give the judicial powers less power and the president himself more power over the country. I'm not going to talk much more about that as I'm no expert in their politics, but I do say that the point is nobody likes him. And that is shown with the demonstrations we currently see outside of his own personal house. It is him that the Israeli people is angry at. Meanwhile, we also have this picture here which shows the clashing on the West Bank, as the yellow ones represent the ones from the 7th of October, while the red ones are the ones who are more recent. So we see clashes all throughout the West Bank. We also see that the Heritage Minister of Israel was suspended from government meetings after he said dropping an A-bomb on Gaza is an option in an interview. Later on, he said on Twitter that any sensible person knew the comments were metaphorical. But in reality, what this really shows is that a Israeli minister, Soweto, admits to the world that Israel has A-bombs, and not just that, he even suggests using them to kill 2 million people. That is insane. Just take a moment to let that sink in. It is crazy, and this is the type of rhetoric around the Palestinian people in the Israeli government right now. He says it's metaphorical. Metaphorical for what? Completely destroying all of Gaza, including the civilians living there. Well, that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.